Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a giant of Greek tragedy, Sophocles' Antigone. And this isn't just, ancient drama, it's almost like a courtroom play.
It really is. It puts justice itself on trial.
Exactly. It stages this fundamental conflict between state power, represented by King Creon, and individual conscience, or maybe divine law, championed by Antigone.
That's the core clash. And our mission today really is to get under the hood of Athenian society. We want to look at the legal and moral ideas floating around back then that made this conflict so electric, so inescapable for the audience.
Because it wasn't just a story for them.
No, not at all. They were living this tension. Was the ultimate authority the state, the polis they'd built, or was it these older, unwritten laws of the gods of family duty? That's the fault line we need to explore.
So we'll be digging into how the Athenian state saw itself, what Creon stood for, and then contrast that with Antigone's appeal to these higher laws.
Precisely. We need to define Creon's world, the structured polis, and Antigone's this older, deeply felt divine obligation, the ius divinum.
Okay, let's start with Creon. He represents the polis, the city-state. His big decree, no burial for the traitor Polynices, seems to come from this belief that civic order is the absolute highest good.
It does. And for the Athenians watching, that idea wasn't just theoretical. It was tied up in their own relatively recent and frankly kind of radical experiment in democracy.
Right, the reforms of Cleisthenes around, 508 BC?
Exactly. We often think of Athenian democracy as this smooth, organic thing. But Cleisthenes' system was highly engineered. It was deliberately artificial in many ways.
Artificial how? What was the goal?
The main goal was political, to break the power of the old aristocratic clans and regional factions that had caused so much instability and tyranny before. The old system was based on birth, on these four ancient tribes.
So what did he put in place instead, if it wasn't based on blood ties?
He replaced social organization with political organization, purely political. He scrapped the four old tribes and created 10 new ones. But the really clever, or maybe artificial part, was how he constructed these tribes using a unit called the trides.
The trides. Okay, I think I remember this. This was the key to breaking up the old power bases.
Absolutely. It was ingenious, really. Before Cleisthenes, politics often revolved around geography. You had the party of the plain, the party of the hill, the party of the coast. These were regional blocks.
Right, based on where people lived and who their local bigwigs were?
Correct. So Cleisthenes kept the basic local units, the demes. These are the natural villages or city wards, but 139 of them. But then he grouped these demes into 30 trides. And here's the trick. Each of the 10 new tribes was made up of 3 trides, one from the coast, one from the inland region, and one from the city area itself.
Wait, so the components of a single tribe were deliberately scattered. They didn't live near each other.
Exactly. They were geographically separated, often by quite a distance. They had no natural shared local economic or social interest.
Wow, so a guy from a coastal deme in Tribe 5 had to work politically with someone from an inland deme in Tribe 5 and someone from the city.
Precisely. The trides itself wasn't really an administrative unit. It had no independent power. Its sole function was to link these diverse, scattered demes together into one tribe for political purposes, electing representatives to the Council of 500, organizing the army. It completely bypassed the old regional loyalties.
That sounds fragile, almost too contrived to actually work, as some scholars have put it, too artificial to last. How did it hold together?
Well, it worked because the foundation stones, the demes, were real natural communities where people knew each other. But the overarching structure forced these local units into a framework that served the state. It redirected loyalty. When a young Athenian man came of age, he wasn't registered by his family name primarily, but by his deme. His official identity became tied to this state structure.
And this wasn't entirely new, right? This idea of civic duty being tied to function and contribution. Didn't Solon lay some groundwork?
Oh, absolutely. Cleisthenes built on Solon's earlier reforms. Solon had established what Aristotle called a timocracy, a system where your rights, your responsibilities, even your eligibility for high office, depended on your assessed wealth, your property class.
So the rich citizens, the top class, got the top jobs, like the 9 archons.
Yes. It wasn't just about rights. It was about obligations measured by your contribution to the state. You serve the polis according to your means. This whole system reinforces the idea that the state gives you structure, identity, stability, and you owe it your allegiance and participation.
Okay, that really clarifies Creon's perspective. If the state is this carefully constructed entity that provides everything, then defying its laws isn't just dissent, it's like pulling a thread that could unravel the whole fabric.
It's an existential threat from his point of view. And this idea, the supremacy of the polis, was something Athenian tragedy itself had explored before Sophocles.
You mean like an Aeschylus?
Exactly. Think about the Oresteia trilogy. How does it end? It ends with the ancient blood feud, the law of the oikos, or household, being resolved and essentially replaced by the law of the polis, the Athenian court system. The Furies are tamed, brought into the civic order.
So the state becomes the ultimate problem solver, taking over from older ways.
Precisely. Creon sees himself in that tradition. He believes he's upholding the necessary authority of the state, the polis, as the final arbiter. His law, the lex, must be absolute for the system to function.
But is his law based on any ethical principle, or is it purely about function, about power?
For Creon, it really seems to be about function and the authority of the lawmaker. There's a parallel here, actually, with later Roman legal thinking.
Oh, how so?
Well, in Roman law, there was a strong tradition that a law's binding force came directly from the authority of the person or body that made it the legislature, the emperor, regardless, sometimes, the ethical content of the law itself.
So the logic is, I am the ruler, I made this law, therefore it is law and you must obey. The why is less important than the who.
That seems to be Creon's position, yes. The authority of the state is the justification. To question his decree isn't just disagreeing with a policy, it's challenging the state's right to rule, its very sovereignty. And that, for him, opens the floodgates to chaos, potentially undoing everything Cleisthenes, metaphorically speaking, had built.
And this wasn't just an abstract fear for the audience. They knew about civic disobedience firsthand. Didn't our sources mention things like dodging military service?
Oh, constantly. That was a huge issue in Athens. It was a democracy, but a very militaristic one. Citizenship meant the obligation to fight. And apparently, many Athenians tried pretty hard to get out of it.
How? What did they do?
There are all sorts of tricks, according to the sources, claiming illness, trying to get assigned to an embassy abroad, getting elected to the council, which sometimes offered exemptions. It was a known problem, a tension everyone was aware of.
So when they watched Creon demanding absolute obedience to his decree,
They would have immediately recognized the underlying tension. Maybe they knew someone, maybe they themselves had bent the rules or ignored a state obligation for personal reasons. Tragedians often put these mythological draft-dodging scenarios or extreme commands on stage precisely because they tapped into this real-world anxiety.
it makes Creon's edict forbidding burial seem like an extreme version of that same conflict. The state demands something horrific, something that violates deep personal or moral feelings. Where do you draw the line?
Exactly. It takes the everyday tension of civic duty versus personal inclination and blows it up to cosmic proportions. Creon's position, his legal extremism, becomes a stark warning.
The lesson being that demanding blind obedience to the state, ignoring the ethical cost, is itself a path to ruin.
Sophocles seems to be showing that the state structure, while necessary, can become monstrous if it operates in a moral vacuum, detached from these deeper unwritten laws.
Okay, let's pivot to Antigone then. She stands for those unwritten, eternal laws of the gods. She explicitly says no human law can override them. She's choosing her family, her blood ties, over the city.
And that choice connects to something very, very old, much older than the Athenian polis. We have to think about the earliest forms of religion in the Mediterranean world.
Before the big state cults.
Way before. In its most ancient forms, religion was often intensely local, domestic, tied to the family, the hearth, the oikos. Specific gods belonged to specific families. They weren't universal deities. Antigone's duty to bury her brother is rooted in this extremely powerful, ancient familial obligation. It's about protecting her specific bloodline from divine anger.
So the gods she's answering to aren't necessarily Zeus Olympios, the protector of the whole city, but maybe darker, older forces tied to the fate of the House of Laius.
It leans that way, yes. Her primary duty is to the dead of her family and the specific gods who oversee those rites. This reflects a widespread ancient anxiety, maintaining the right relationship with the divine. Look at the Romans again, with their edict divinum, the divine law.
What was the focus there?
The main goal wasn't really about asking for personal favors or blessings. It was about maintaining the pax deorum, the peace of the gods.
The peace of the gods, like keeping them happy.
Exactly. It was about keeping the divine powers neutral, or at least not actively hostile, through meticulous performance of rituals, sacrifices, prayers, vows. Any failure in ritual, any impiety could break that peace and bring disaster.
So it's like a cosmic balancing act. Don't upset the gods.
Pretty much. And the Greeks absolutely believed that misconduct, especially impiety like leaving the dead unburied, would bring divine retribution, maybe on the whole community, but definitely starting with the family involved. Gods weren't just benevolent. They could be invoked for curses, for vengeance. They demanded appeasement through correct ritual action.
So Antigone isn't just being stubborn or political. She genuinely fears the consequences for herself, for her sister Ismene, for the whole cursed family line if Polynices isn't given the proper rights.
It's an act of cosmic risk management, in a way. She's trying to prevent further disaster by fulfilling this fundamental religious duty.
And her motivation is tied up with these really weighty Greek concepts, dikai, which we usually translate as justice, and telos. Can you unpack telos for us? It seems to carry a lot of weight here.
Oh, telos is incredibly rich and, honestly, pretty ambiguous in tragedy. It's one of those words doing heavy lifting on multiple levels. At its simplest, yes, it means end or goal or final point, the end of the play, the end of a life.
But there's more to it.
Much more, especially in a ritual context. It also means consummation or fulfillment, particularly the proper completion of a religious rite, like a sacrifice. Think of finishing something perfectly. And thirdly, it can mean payment, like paying a tax, a due, or a debt.
So when Antigone talks about seeking the telos of Dike, the fulfillment of justice,
She could mean several things at once. She's seeking the proper completion of justice for her brother through the burial rite. She's seeking the fulfillment of her religious duty. And her own death, which is the price she pays, becomes the tragic consummation of her quest for justice. It's like a final fatal payment.
and death itself is often framed as a sacrifice in these plays.
Absolutely. Her death isn't just a punishment. It takes on the quality of a ritual act, a sacrifice to satisfy the demands of this unwritten law. You see this language elsewhere. Clytemnestra in Aeschylus calls on Zeus Teleos, Zeus the fulfiller, to bring her murderous plan against Agamemnon to its consummation. It's chilling.
So Antigone is seeking the ritual completion required by her blood ties, the pre-Pepilus obligations. And she accepts that the price, the telos in the sense of payment, might be her own life.
It's a stark choice. She prioritizes the sacred duty to family and the gods over her life within the civic structure of Thebes.
And the fact that she chooses this, that her defiance is deliberate, is really significant in how the Greeks thought about wrongdoing, isn't it?
Hugely significant. There was this deep-seated connection in popular morality between suffering, pathos, and some kind of prior wrongdoing, Atacoma. But the crucial question was always about intent.
Right, the difference between messing up accidentally versus doing it on purpose.
Exactly. They made a very clear distinction between acts that were hekusios, unwilling, unintentional, maybe done in ignorance, and acts that were ekusios, deliberate, voluntary, intentional.
And the unintentional wrongs were treated differently, more leniently.
Generally, yes. They might still require purification or compensation, but they were considered forgivable, or at least less culpable. But Antigone's act, it's undeniably Akusios. She knows Creon's law, she knows the death penalty is threatened, she understands the consequences perfectly, and she chooses to defy the law anyway.
So from Creon's legal standpoint, her action falls into the most serious category regardless of her personal justification.
Absolutely. Her intent makes it treasonous in his eyes. There's no excuse of ignorance or accident.
And didn't the orator Aeschines link impiety directly to harming the state?
He did. He essentially defined impiety not just as offending the gods, but as committing acts that harm the community and specifically disrupt the proper functioning of the Constitution. So Antigone's religiously motivated act by directly challenging the king's edict could be framed by Creon as a form of civic impiety, an attack on the legal order of the polis.
So her piety towards the gods becomes impiety towards the state. What a bind.
It's the central tragic bind of the play.
Which brings us to the civic lesson. Sophocles doesn't make it easy. There are no clear winners, just destruction on both sides. Both Creon and Antigone are destroyed by their refusal to compromise.
Exactly. It's a powerful illustration of the dangers of extremism, both legal and moral. It taps right into that philosophical debate. Can you separate what is honorable, from what is useful or expedient, symphoron?
Creon clearly thinks you can. He argues for expediency, the state's stability must come first, even if forbidding burial feels wrong.
Right. He prioritizes utility over honor. But many ancient thinkers, like Cicero, later drawing on Greek ideas, argued this separation was fundamentally flawed.
They thought honor and utility were naturally linked.
Yes. Cicero famously wrote that thinking, that is honorable, But this is expedient is a dangerous error, the very source of fraud, crime, and all wrongdoing. Nature, they believed, intended for what is good and what is advantageous to be the same thing.
So Creon, by separating them, by putting state utility above divine law or basic human decency.
Is committing a kind of philosophical crime, according to this line of thought. He's trying to take something for the state, order, authority that rightly belongs elsewhere, to the gods, to traditional morality.
Oh.
As philosophers said, a just person doesn't take from another to benefit himself. Creon is trying to take moral authority from the gods to benefit the state.
An overreach that ultimately backfires spectacularly.
It leads directly to the destruction of his family and his authority, the very things his expediency was supposed to protect. It's a profound warning against divorcing political action from a moral foundation.
Okay, but if Antigone's immediate radical defiance is also presented as destructive, what was the alternative? For an Athenian audience member watching this, knowing their own political system, how else might this conflict have been handled?
That's a really important question because it underscores just how extreme Antigone's choice is. Athenian democracy, for all its flaws, did have established procedures for citizens to challenge officials or question potentially unjust actions. Even though the play is set in mythical Thebes under a king, the Athenian audience would have had their own civic mechanisms in mind.
Mechanisms like what? You mentioned isengelia.
Yes, isengelia. This was essentially a form of impeachment. A citizen could bring a charge against a public official, maybe a general who bungled a campaign, or an archon accused of corruption or trying to subvert the democracy directly before the assembly or the council.
So theoretically, someone in Thebes could have tried to bring an isengelia against Creon, arguing his decree was harmful to the state because it offended the gods and risked divine punishment.
It's conceivable within the Athenian mindset, yes. Or there was another procedure called apophasis. This usually involved the Areopagus Council, the very respected body of former archons investigating and reporting on major crimes against the state, potentially leading to trials.
The point being there were channels, formal, public, procedural ways to address grievances against authority.
Exactly. They might be slow, they might be political, but they existed.
Right.
Antigone chooses none of them. She goes straight to direct action, to confrontation.
Which highlights that the tragedy isn't just about state law versus divine law, but maybe also about political process versus absolute principle. Her choice bypasses any possibility of compromise or civic resolution.
It does. It rejects the mechanisms of the polis. The existence of these procedures suggests the play is also a commentary on the method of resistance. Is immediate principled defiance the only way? Or is working within the system, even a flawed system, preferable? The play shows the devastating cost of the former.
And this idea of finding more flexible ways to deal with conflict, ways beyond rigid formal law, that was happening elsewhere too, right? Like in Roman law.
It was a general trend in legal development. You mentioned the Roman Odyssus Gentium, the law of nations. That evolved partly because the old Roman civil law, the aegis civil, was incredibly rigid and formal. Aegis Gentium allowed for more flexible agreements like contracts based just on mutual consent, which were needed for trade and interaction with non-Romans. You recognize that life is messy and requires adaptable rules.
So Creon's rigid adherence to his edict is like sticking to the old, inflexible aegis civil when the situation cries out for something more nuanced.
That's a good analogy. The tragedy dramatizes the failure of that kind of legal rigidity when faced with deep moral or religious conviction. It pushes conceptually toward the need for synthesis, for finding ways to accommodate conflicting principles.
So if the play ends in disaster for both sides and doesn't give a clear winner, how does it function as that synthesis? What's the takeaway for the citizen watching?
I think it functions almost like those Roman legal experts, the prudantes and their responsa.
The answers of the learned, how did they work again?
They would issue interpretations of existing laws, like the ancient 12 tables. On the surface, they were just explaining the law. But in practice, their interpretations could subtly modify, extend, or even effectively overrule the literal text of the old laws without ever saying the sacred text was wrong. It was a way to adapt the law to new realities while maintaining respect for tradition.
Okay, so they were creating a synthesis between the old text and the current needs through interpretation.
Exactly. And I think tragedy, especially Antigone, did something similar for the Athenian audience. By staging this brutal, irreconcilable conflict between Creon's written law and Antigone's unwritten law, Sophocles forces the audience to perform their own act of interpretation, their own synthesis. They are forced to see the limits of both positions. Creon's state authority is necessary, yes, but it becomes tyranny when it ignores fundamental morality. Antigone's absolute moral conviction is admirable, perhaps, but its refusal to engage with the civic order leads to destruction and chaos.
So the play doesn't give the answer, it poses the question in the starkest possible terms.
Precisely. It compels the citizen viewer to think critically about the balance. Where does justice lie? How do we reconcile the demands of the state with the demands of conscience? It turns the theater into a space for civic deliberation, forcing the audience to wrestle with finding a middle ground, a way for honor and utility to coexist.
So the lesson isn't about choosing sides, but about the necessity of constantly evaluating positive law against deeper principles.
It's about the ongoing difficult work of achieving a just society, one that recognizes the validity of both the written and the unwritten laws.
Okay, so wrapping this up, our deep dive really shows Antigone as this incredibly sophisticated exploration of the tension between, on one hand, the necessary structure of the state, that complex, maybe even artificial polis built by reforms like Cleisthenes, and on the other, these deeply rooted obligations to family, religion, conscience, tied up in ideas like telos and the fear of divine anger.
And the stark warning for the original audience, and maybe for us too, is the catastrophic danger of prioritizing one of these poles, whether it's state expediency or absolute moral principle, to the total exclusion of the other. It's a masterclass in the perils of extremism.
It really forces you to think about obedience and defiance. If we take Antigone's act as this pure expression of moral freedom, defying an unjust law regardless of the cost, what does that suggest about our own relationship with the laws we live under?
Well, it leads to a fascinating and maybe uncomfortable idea from some later philosophers, particularly those influenced by Stoicism, like Zeno or Dio Chrysostom. They've talked about true slavery.
True slavery, as
opposed to just legal slavery. They argued that real slavery wasn't just a matter of legal status. It was a condition of the soul, of the mind. You could be legally free, but enslaved by your passions, your fears, or your willingness to compromise your principles. Conversely, someone legally enslaved could possess true freedom in their mind if they maintained their moral integrity.
So if Antigone, by choosing defiance based on conscience, achieves a kind of true freedom even in death,
then the challenging question for us, living in any organized society, becomes, when we obey laws or commands that we feel are fundamentally unjust, simply out of expediency or fear, are we choosing a form of voluntary slavery, not slavery imposed by chains, but slavery chosen through a failure of moral courage?
Wow. So the play leaves us asking, what is the relationship between true freedom and the willingness to defy the expedient when it clashes with the honorable?
It's a question that resonates far beyond ancient Athens, a truly provocative thought to end on.